Yesh Kadakia. He's the founder of Security Brigade, an information security consulting firm, and Shadow Map, a digital risk management platform. He is involved in research that analyzes the large amounts of data captured to understand security and privacy implications. Yash would be speaking on DevSecOps, a story of three hacks. Yash, do we have you with us?
Hey, yes, I'm here.
Yeah, thank you, Yash, for joining in. People who are interested to know more about him, please connect to him on LinkedIn or look at his page on LinkedIn. Yash, over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Dipti. I'll share my screen and we'll go from there. Yeah. Hey, so I'm assuming you can all see my screen now, right?
Yeah.
We can.
Okay, perfect. So this is going to be a little bit of a different talk, right? We'll focus more on the idea was to take and look at DevSecOps from a sort of a different perspective. So I'll give a little background about myself and what we've done, right? So essentially for the last 20 years, my role has, to put it very simply, been breaking things, right? So working with different customers to see how we can break networks, applications, systems, hardware, whatever it is, right? And find ways around that and then works backwards towards security. So like I said, right, so Shadow Map does digital risk management, Security Brigade does security consulting. So the talk I have today is sort of putting the two things together and looking from a DevSecOps perspective. And that's the general idea, right? So when I was coming up with the topic, right, so the idea was how do we change perspective at what we're looking at, right? Typically, when we talk DevSecOps, people will generally talk about how to build DevSecOps, what are the different kind of platforms, what are the different kinds of integrations, how the actual implementation needs to work, right? I sort of wanted to cover a different perspective today and focus more from a hacker's perspective as to when we go about doing our red team assessments and breaking into organizations, right? What's the kind of entry points we find? What's the kind of journey we have as hackers? And then the lessons that we can take from that into DevSecOps and sort of identifying the gaps in our DevSecOps processes. And that's something that I think is missed out a lot in the industry, right? People typically focus on implementing controls, sort of getting best practices in place, but they don't spend as much time focusing on how those things can be broken, and then sort of having an iterative process where you break it, you sort of rebuild, fix those gaps, and then you break it again, and then you eventually get to a point where you have a reasonably hardened process. So that's the idea today, right? And what we've done is we've taken three hacks that are genuine hacks that our team conducted for customers in the last couple of months. And I've sort of taken three different kinds of hacks, three different stories that will tell three different kinds of challenges that customers have, right? When it comes to security, or when it comes to the DevOps practices. Yeah. So I'll start with the first one, right? The domino effect. So this is one of my favorite hacks that we've done in 2020, right? So the customers was a large unicorn customer who came to us and basically said, we want you to outside in, looking at us from the outside, right? See what can you do. Everything is in your scope, right? You want to hack our network, go for a network. You want to hack our cloud. You want to hack our people, our desktops, our laptops, our office. You can essentially do anything you want to and then come back to us and tell us what you were able to access and what you were able to do, right? So that was sort of the starting point that they started here, right? And when we looked at that customer security, we realized that they had followed a lot of best practices, right? Their public footprint was incredibly small. They had restricted all their internal systems to their VPN. They had all these best practices in place. They were carrying out continuous testing, continuous security assessments, code reviews. They had WAFs in place. They had all these controls that were already in place, right? So we clearly sat back and said, okay, this is going to be a challenge, right? The customer seems to have a reasonably good security practice in place already. We're going to have to really work towards getting the end goal, right? And what happened with this particular hack or this particular red team that we did was it was a lot of small things that failed that resulted in a much larger failure, right? And that's where the domino effect comes from. So I sort of tell that story, and I think there's a lot of really interesting DevSecOps lessons here because it's a lot of things that people don't think about until, of course, somebody like us comes around and does this hack, and then you look back and sort of scratch your head and go, we completely missed that. So I'll start with that, right? And I'll run through each part of the journey of that hack, essentially. So when we were starting out, right? So they were running a microservices architecture with a whole bunch of backend microservices, and we found a bunch of proxy servers that were sitting on the internet and that were being used to allow communication with those backend proxy servers, right? So we saw those and we realized that there were a whole bunch of internal domains that they were using to host those microservices in their AWS. So we started there and we realized that the proxy server was misconfigured, right? We could put in any host address or any subdomain and the proxy server would go ping that subdomain, make that request and bring the response back to us. So that became the first entry point where we said, okay, we have access into this customer's network now, this customer's cloud now, and we can access web resources inside the network that aren't supposed to be accessed, right? So that became the first initial failure where we could access something from the outside. We then found that there were some systems running that had default credentials on the inside. And using that proxy server, we were able to then access those default credential systems and get access to I think it was about 5,000 passwords for their corporate employees that were stored in their database, right? So we said, okay, now we've got access to some passwords for an internal system that we could not access. So the passwords are there, but they weren't really very valuable. We had access to the proxy server and we could sort of figure out and hit internal subdomains inside the network, right? So that became the entry point. We then realized that they were using a weak password pattern, right? So pretty much, one of the things that we've seen with a lot of companies now, right, is they generally have two-factor authentication. They generally try to have single sign-on. They try to restrict their access to VPN. And people don't focus on password policy, right, as much as they do on those other controls. And that was the case in this organization as well. So the passwords were all company @ 123, 1234, 12345, so on and so forth, right? So we made a nice big list of all possible passwords. And using the list of emails that we had, we started brute forcing those passwords and saying, okay, how many people can we find valid passwords for? And I think towards the end of it, we had about 1,000 or so users that had valid passwords that we could access, right? So which right there was a fairly large number. But the twist was that they were using single sign-on for everything. I think it was Google sign-on connected to Microsoft Outlook sign-on, Microsoft Azure AD rather, and everything required an OTP. So even though we had 1,000 valid passwords, we couldn't really do anything with those 1,000 passwords. We could just simply, we would be able to log into the account and get an OTP and then you'd get locked out, right? So that was where we were stuck. At some point, somebody realized that we found one lonesome VPN server that was running without two-factor. It was one of the instances that they had. So that became the next step, right? Where we got VPN access, but VPN would only work we would only be able to use it as a gateway. So what that means is we could connect to the internet using VPN, but we could not connect to any internal resources or the LAN or anything of that sort. But we figured that was one step forward, right? And we started digging further and further. The next thing we found was a couple of internal portals that were using Google sign-on. But what they were doing as a mistake, right? So what happens is now they implemented Google single sign-on and they figured it's secure, right? The mistake they made was, even though it was implemented, when the request was coming back from the Google server, it would just check to see whether it was authenticated. It wouldn't check to see which domain or which user got authenticated. So we could open the Google single sign-on, enter our own personal email addresses, so yash@securitybrigade.com, enter my legitimate password. Google would send a request back saying, hey, yash@securitybrigade.com is logged in, and they would accept it and give us access to the internal portals. So they were checking authentication, they were not checking authorization, right? So that became the next step where we were able to then start bypassing single sign-on on certain portals that they had. So that became one step forward for us. Using that issue, we found that there was a Jenkins instance running on their AWS cloud, but it was whitelisted to their Office IP addresses. Luckily for us, we had VPN access, and that VPN gateway IP address was whitelisted as well. So suddenly Jenkins had opened up for us, right? And I'm sure a lot of you all have used Jenkins since obviously you're in the testing space. But what Jenkins gives you is it gives you a ability to create new builds, right? So we would go create a new build, and inside the build, we would essentially write a command in, right? So as part of a deployment script that you're giving Jenkins, we would write a command in and say, hey, email the Jenkins, save passwords file to us, email the encryption keys to us, email certain files on the local server to us, using the mail command. And it would obviously do that, right? So when the build would be deployed, our commands would run that we had hard-coded inside Jenkins. And the encryption files and the credential files that are stored locally in Jenkins would be sent out to us. And then we could use a tool that we had to decrypt them. So suddenly we had access to a whole bunch of passwords that were saved in Jenkins, right? Using that, we got access to GitHub API keys. Once we got access to GitHub API keys, now a lot of people don't know this, right? So if you have a GitHub account and you have two-factor authentication enabled, if I'm able to get access to your API keys or access token, your two-factor is bypassed. Because the API obviously gets around the 2FA, right? So using those API keys, we were then able to use the command line mode for GitHub and get a list of all the repositories, check out all of the repositories, and essentially get their entire source code based on our local machines, right? So that became the next step. Using those repositories, we found a DevOps repository where they had stored a local copy of their SSH keys and some AWS S3 bucket keys and EC2 instance keys as well. So we were able to use those as well. Now, so I'm hoping you'll follow into so far, right? But at this point, we have access to VPN, which we can use to get their gateway IP address and connect to their AWS, which has been IP restricted. We have got access to their GitHub code. We have got access to SSH keys and AWS keys. All of this is great, right? But the challenge was they had 0 SSH instances running publicly, right? All of their SSH instances were restricted to IP addresses that were not part of the VPN gateway. So we were not able to, we had the keys and the passwords, but we were just not able to connect to any VPN instances because, SSH instances because they were not publicly open. The next thing we realized was that they had a bunch of users in their IAM that did not have keys attached to them. So using admin AWS keys, we were able to attach keys to those users, use that to trigger reverse shells using a hack IAM script that we have to trigger a reverse shell. So where we can convince the server, we can convince AWS to initiate a reverse connection from the server to our remote servers. So we did that. And that's where the SSH access got established. And then we were able to use the SSH keys and we were able to get SSH access into the machines, right? And then, of course, the users had sudo access, so we got into root. Using that, they had a whole bunch of SSH keys saved in their infra, right? So inside the thousands of servers that they had, you could hop between all of the different servers completely freely because they had no restrictions, no access control there. And we could sort of hop between those machines and access all these different servers, access the databases, access the code servers, the front-end servers, Nginx servers, and pretty much take complete control of their infra, right? King of the hill, essentially, right? So that was sort of a journey that we had at one particular organization. The point here, right, is, and what you'll see here, is there wasn't one glaring failure, right? It wasn't one vulnerability. It wasn't one high-risk security issue that took place that we were able to exploit and then compromise, right? It wasn't the traditional concept of, say, for example, they had a remote command execution vulnerability, or they had a SQL injection or something, and we leveraged that and we went forward and we compromised everything, right? The idea is that there was a whole bunch of small failures, small DevOps lapses, small places where the security component of DevOps was not considered, right? And those are the challenges that as attackers, we typically use to really go inside an organization, right? This is the case at pretty much most companies we work with, where, of course, in some organizations, you'll have that big glaring problem, right? But at most places, most organizations are great at closing those big glaring problems. Where they struggle is to close those small gaps, small issues across the board that from an attacker's perspective, you can really use to go and compromise things, right? And then working backwards, right? When we sat down with the customer and we said, okay, what are the things we can do to fix this? There were a lot of small things that could be done, right? For example, why were their entire development team using the same set of SSH keys, right? We need to have separate keys, separate permissions, separate access control, so that that single key getting leaked doesn't result in everything getting compromised, right? The single sign-on was, of course, a simple security issue. Why was there Jenkins without authentication where it was just completely open? Why was build functionality enabled to us when we did not have permissions or we were not supposed to have any permissions to those? Why were SSH and AWS keys stored in plain text in their DevOps repos when they need to be maintained as credentials? Why was VPN not using two-factor authentication? Why were weak passwords allowed? Why did you have a proxy that was allowing internal communication? So it's a whole bunch of questions that were asked, right? And what we typically did was we sat with that customer and then we looked at the DevOps processes and we figured out all the different controls that we could put into place, whether it's processes, whether it's scripts, whether it's tools that would integrate, that would help address some of these challenges, right? And then it's an incremental process. So this particular customer, I think we did 3 engagements after that with as well. And all 3 engagements, we ended up with root access to the entire infra. But all 3 times we did it in different ways. So the idea is you do this as an incremental process, and then each time you sort of shut one route, one path that an attacker has to get to your key assets. And you take those learnings and you try to leverage them. And hopefully, eventually, you get to a point where it's really, really hard for an attacker to go inside, right? And then you up the ante. So you can then give them employee access, so give them the same set of access that a normal employee has, and then go from there and sort of work on that, right? So that's the one big gap that I see that I keep advising customers or just anybody on, that you really need to test your DevOps practices or your DevOps flow to make sure that you're really, it's not just a namesake sort of checklist, right? You're really addressing the gaps that that exist in their customers in your infra, essentially, or in your processes. So this was one of a really complicated sort of hack that we had, where it took several days, and each time we hit a wall, and then we would solve that challenge, and then hit another wall, and then keep going until we eventually got that hash prompt that you get when you get root, right? Which is what all hackers are looking for. So this is something of that sort, right? So so the domino effect was one example, and this is something we see very often, where things just start falling once you get the first entry point, right? The next is the weakest link. So this is something that actually happened fairly recently for a customer a couple of months ago, and a really interesting story, right? So this customer, an enterprise customer, fairly large, and of course, had a lot of security controls in place. They, because of the nature of their business, essentially what they had done was 99% of their infra was inside their office, right? Inside their network, on their LAN only. And only a couple of things were publicly accessible. And whatever was publicly accessible was on a separate, isolated cloud. So even when we compromised those applications or those infra because of coding issues, there was really nowhere further to go, right? There wasn't really, none of the crown jewels were hosted on that cloud infra. Everything was inside their office infra, right? So we spent a few weeks brainstorming and really kind of figure out what do we go after, right? We run a shadow map scan, we get a report, and we look at their complete exposure footprint. And we realized that they have a couple of ITSM portals that were publicly opened, right? Because of work from home and things, they'd opened those ITSM portals so that folks can go raise a ticket when their laptop stops working or the charger stops working or something of that sort. So that became our focus, right? We used some phishing emails, and suddenly we had compromised a couple of senior users who had access to those ITSM portals. We compromised those users, and we start using them. We log in with their accounts. And in a couple of minutes, we have access to the ITSM portals, right? Of course, this is a dummy screenshot, but we have access to the ITSM portals, and we start browsing through the tickets, and we're browsing through thousands of tickets, and we write a script to dump all the data that we could find out of those tickets, start grepping through them and searching for data inside them. And we start finding all sorts of passwords. We start finding people asking for their AD passwords to be reset. The IT guys responding with a plain text password. We find internal shared accounts. We find Excel sheets with all these shared accounts. So we found a whole bunch of information that would compromise everything, right? We found internal VNC passwords being used for all their IT management systems. And then suddenly that single weak link resulted in a complete compromise, right? So we were able to immediately get remote access into the network, get into the VPN, and then using the VNC credentials that were shared for all the machines, essentially go and access pretty much every server, every desktop that we wanted to, and then go start compromising things and achieve our red team goals from there, right? So this was a little bit of a different, the first one, of course, we had a really complicated part to try to get to where we wanted to get to. In this case, the customer had done a great job with security, besides for that 1 weak link where they had kept everything, right? And I think that's another key component that I think a lot of people miss out on, is where they don't do threat modeling, right? From a security standpoint, it's really important to look at your entire infra and really understand your priorities, right? Okay, ITSM, single point of failure could result in everything getting compromised. Let's mark that as an absolute L1 asset, and let's really focus on it, right? Something else that, say, a monitoring system or a log collection system or something that again has access to a lot of different machines, let's mark those as L1 and really secure them, right? And those security ratings or those prioritizations that you do should then drive your DevSecOps processes that are going to decide what are the measures, what are the controls that you take, right? Second, that system was tagged as an L1 system, it should not have been an internet exposed system where anybody could log in. There should have been 2FA. There should have been more monitoring or alerts on that. We of course logged into administrative accounts from different IP addresses and accessed thousands of tickets in a day, which was abnormal behavior. So behavioral analysis should have picked it up. So the idea is to look at those controls. Then from a DevOps perspective, think about what could we have done to detect, monitor, and respond to that particular attack. Build that in and apply it to all your L1 or L2 systems, whatever sort of risk matrix you create, right? But that makes a huge difference because you're not just saying, hey, let's put things on land, but you're actually addressing the concern of what happens afterwards, right? Of course, there's a whole other question of they should have had better credential management. They should have had better sharing of data. They should have had better password expiries and all of those things as well, right? And this is something that's very common as well, where folks typically focus on protecting from the outside in, right? Let's focus on the remote attacker or the remote hack and ignore or forget everything on the inside. Once you compromise one entry point, everything starts to fall and essentially you have access to everything, right? And that's a very common practice as well, because anytime in cybersecurity, right, people's tendency is always, is it public? Let's invest lots of money, protect it. If it's internal, we'll worry about it later because what's going to happen on the internal network, right? And that's typically the mindset we see as well. And that's completely not true because when you look at cybersecurity, right, at any point, it's always about multiple layers of security, because what you have to do is you have to assume that your outer layer is always going to fall, right? At some point of time, someday, a new vulnerability will come out, a patch will get missed, a new code push will go out with a bad code in it. Something's going to happen, right? And your outer layer is going to get compromised. And you have to think from that perspective, assuming your outer layer gets compromised, what are all the things I can do on my innermost layers to sort of mitigate the explosion of that attack, right? How do we reduce the blast radius, essentially, is the question that we need to ask, and that a lot of people miss out on. So it could be something as simple as, can we have DMZs? I mean, can we have a DMZ there where it does not have access to the internal LAN? So even though we had passwords, we would have had no way to talk to that LAN, right? It could have been isolation where you create VLANs where only certain machines are accessible. And a whole bunch of other things could have been done to sort of address those challenges, right? So that's one thing that we really need to look at that get missed out a lot. The third one is, again, one of the hacks that I really enjoyed, one of the engagements that I really enjoyed, right? So this was for one of the banking organizations, and obviously they had an absolute amazing amount of security in place, right? And the customer had come to us with a singular goal, right? We need you all to access our Swift servers. That's the only objective that we had. So we could have gone and compromised all the public stuff that we wanted to try to compromise. But typically the Swift server is always very far deep into the LAN. It's not really going to be publicly accessible and things, right? So there wasn't really much we could do from that perspective. Again, in this case as well, we compromised some cloud instances, marketing portals, brand portals, landing pages, things of that nature. But we were not able to compromise anything substantial, no net banking, nothing of that sort, right? Because obviously those things are much more secure and much heavily protected, monitored. We tried phishing attacks, and then within 20 minutes of sending the phishing attacks, our links got blocked because their SOC detected it, responded to it, and sort of took it out, right? So we realized that's not going to work for us. And we started brainstorming, what do we do? What's an outside of the box approach to sort of go after this customer, right? And we had a really interesting idea, and we thought, let's give it a shot. There's nothing to lose, right? So I don't know how many of you have seen this, but we had these handheld RFID writers, right? It's basically like a gun. You point it at an RFID card, and it will read from a certain distance, and it will read the card. And then you can point it to a blank card and hit the right option, and it starts writing the card, right? So you can clone anybody's card on the fly. So what we started doing is we took this little RFID thing, put it in our hand, and we would casually spend an hour or 2 hours in the customer's elevator in their office building, right? So they had a floor in the office building, and so obviously there was no security on the ground level. So we would go in the elevator, and we would keep going up and down the elevator, waiting for somebody from the customer team to have their ID card, put on their hip or hanging around their waist, and not paying attention, right? And sure enough, about 30 minutes in, we found somebody who had that ID card over here, busy talking on their phone or texting or something, I can't remember. And one of our guys silently goes, points that gun to that RFID card, hits read, and it's done. So now we've got a copy of that RFID card, right? We go back to office, we take a blank card, put a write on it. We also usually have pen cameras on when we're doing these engagements. So we take the pen camera out, we look at exactly how the lanyard looks. We call our printing partner, get him to print some brand new lanyards for us that look exactly like the customer's lanyard, right? Print a new card sticker out and all of those things. Put it on nicely the next day at lunchtime. We went and we walked right into the customer's office at lunchtime, right? Because there's always going to be there's always a rush at lunchtime, and the security guards typically don't check as much, right? Went in, tapped our card. Of course, it works because it's a copy of a real card. Walked right in, walked into the office, walked around for some time, basically just pretended like we're employees, right? Walked around for about 15, 20 minutes, tried to identify which employees have not come to office today, right? Because there might be empty desks, but maybe they've just gone for lunch. So we walked around for a bit, found somebody that this has not come to office today, went to their desk, sat down, put a laptop down, took the LAN cable that was there, plugged it in, and we were on the network, right? At that point, of course, then we have these wireless devices that we can plug into the LAN cable, create a fake Wi-Fi network, go outside of office and access everything remotely and stuff like that, right? So we did a whole bunch of other hacks post that. But the basic conclusion from that was we got into the LAN, used the VLAN hopping technique where we can change VLANs to switch onto the customer's really sensitive VLANs, and they didn't have MAC restrictions on those. And then we were able to go and access those Swift servers, and we did some internal attacks and access Citrix and things, and then finally got inside and got our way through, right? So this was really interesting. So again, the point here and the reason I wanted to highlight this hack, right, is the attacker is not always coming in the path you expect them to come, right? It's not always going to come through your web server, through your public interfaces. And you have to sort of be prepared for these sort of attacks as well, right? So you have to really think of your infra from a holistic standpoint, and then build your practices and controls to address those, right? So, I mean, in this case, it's simple, right? Why was VLAN hopping enabled? Why was a random laptop or a random computer allowed to connect to the network? The RFID one was hard to prevent, right? There really isn't much you can do in that context. Why were we were sitting in a desk working on this unknown laptop, and there were people sitting all around us in an open plan office, right? Why in the world did nobody even wonder who we were? So awareness was a factor. So those sort of things need to be looked into and to be able to sort of address that, right? The point being that there's, when we look at DevOps or when we look at security from a DevOps perspective, we're often only looking at, how do we make sure code reviews are happening? How do we make sure Git secrets are being addressed? How do we make sure credentials are separated? But there's a lot of blind spots and a lot of areas where we don't look at. And those are the ones that attackers like us will typically come from and go after, right? The thing I keep telling customers is, and I've said this for years, right, is I am never going to walk into your front door, right? I know your front door has security. I know your front door has monitoring. I know your front door is going to be restricted, and, it's going to be absolute Fort Knox, right? If it's up to me, every single time I'm going to find a side door and go after that, right? Because that side door will probably, so I'll give you an example of a staging server, right? We do this all the time where we find a customer staging server and we'll hack that instead because it contains the same code. There's a significant chance that it has access to the production databases. It might be on the same LAN, credentials could be sitting in the code commented. So from an attacker standpoint, I can go after the staging instance, which probably doesn't have a web application firewall, probably it isn't connected to the SIM, probably does not have hardened code or secured code because it's got daily builds going out. And nobody's really looking at it, right? And I can use that as a launch pad to then go after the internal assets and sort of compromise those things, right? So that's always the approach that we have. And that's what I have found is always the gap that most startups, most technology companies that we deal with have as well. So that's something that I want to highlight as well, right? Yeah, so this was an actual photo that our team sent back. So this was them sitting in the customer canteen, I believe, putting a security brigade hat on. And I think what you see on the table is the fake RFID card and the lanyard that they were using. So they took this photo to include in the customer's PowerPoint presentation to sort of show them that, yes, we actually made it inside your office. So that was a pretty fun day when you presented that forward to the customer as well. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of tools, there's obviously tons of tools available, right? So I won't really go into that per se because depending on your problem statement, there's a whole bunch of different DevSecOps tools available that you can integrate and plug into your flow. And all of them have different value, right? So whether it's something like a Git secret, helping make sure credentials are out of your code, whether it's a Cloudflare, making sure you have a WAF and DDoS protection, whether it's a Tenable, that's continuously scanning your servers for patches and things. So there's a whole bunch of different things that you can integrate into your Jira or into your release cycle, into your Jenkins or your release cycles, and make the process really easy, right? So that's not really the difficult part. The difficult part is the visibility, making sure that you cover everything and not just cover what you think is important, and making sure you cover all the angles, right? I mean, I can't tell you the number of times customers will have secured everything and then left their Jenkins or their SonarQube or their Splunk or something, Kibana open to us. And that's how the hack starts and we get inside, right? So, I mean, it's an amazing amount of times where the DevSecOps tools are the ones that we compromise to start compromising the customer as well, which genuinely does happen more often than you would think. Generally speaking, right? So I think it's really critical that you think about the DevSecOps lifecycle, look at the overall flow and really try to red team those gaps and then sort of, like I said, iterate and come back to a flow that really works for you and addresses your gaps. Credential secret management is something that I see is not in place at 95% of organizations we look at across the world, right? Where passwords are either hard-coded, passwords are either kept in environment files and things, and a really comprehensive password management process is not in place. And as a result of that, password change policies are not, and when I'm talking about passwords, I'm talking about database passwords, S3 buckets, and things like that, which are not user passwords, right? People are not storing credentials well. And that's one of the biggest gaps we get, right? One vulnerability and I've got your credentials, I can now go and start compromising things, right? Secure coding practices, of course, like I said, SonarQube and manual testing and a whole bunch of other things exist that you can look at there, right? Training awareness is one thing I see is a big gap as well. What we typically recommend, right? And I think a lot of companies don't implement this, is every time you do security assessments, even if it's just internal, right? Even if it's just SonarQube, you have to look at training after that to sort of teach your developers what the problem was, right? So it should not be that in their head they have SQL injection. This is how we fix a SQL injection. They need to understand. They need to see the impact, right? The first hack that I spoke about, right? The dominoes effect one. What we did in that case was we actually presented that hack to the entire development about, I think about 400 or 500 developers that they had, right? And with screenshots and the actual attack that we did. And they would just sit there and, sit back and be shocked because they knew some of these problems, but they never realized that these problems can come together to have that larger impact. And I think more than an outside consultant, your developers know where all the dirt is, right? They know the keys that are shared. They know the bad practices that are in place. So if you do a good job explaining that impact to them or the sort of value of these sort of security gaps, what kind of impact there is on the business, on the infra, and everybody likes hacks, right? Everybody likes the idea of listening about hacks and it's always interesting. They will then pay attention and they will then start coming to you with all these problems, right? So I'll give you an example. Make My Trip years ago used to have a SecAwesome week every year, right? And I think they still do, where they used to have a security awareness week every year, bringing speakers in from all over the world. What they also did was they used to have a hackathon for their employees to find and report security issues with prizes and things, right? And your developers always know where the security issues are. So they would always come back and quickly prompt those issues out and that would help them out. So that was a great idea as well. Access control, like I said, right? A lot of companies tend to whitelist things internally and not restrict them. So that's something that needs to be absolutely critical. Config management, again, that has to be centralized, right? It has to, you have to use console or something of that sort to really centrally drive your configuration changes. It can't really be a one-by-one process, right? Vulnerability management. So again, as most folks move to Docker and things, vulnerability management is becoming less relevant because it's easier to secure those images versus thousands of instances. But either of those moves have to be made, right? And the last piece is tech and data footprint. So this is one that's really ignored. But do you really know your technology footprint, right, is the question. Do you know how many servers you have, how many cloud instances you have, where are they? Are they behind WAFs? Are they behind patch management? Are they behind, what controls are in place? Who's monitoring them? And having that inventory in a somewhat real-time fashion, especially with the sort of release cycles that most of the organizations have, right? Where you're pushing things out every day. I'll give you an example for one of the startups we were working with. When we were doing the shadow map assessment for them, they told us they had one AWS account, right? When we came back with a report, we had found 17 AWS accounts because all these different dev teams were just pinning up their own AWS accounts and using them and reimbursing the cost. And they were shadow instances, right? They weren't really production instances. But of course, they were all at risk, had data. So that visibility for your technology, but also for your data, right? Where is data across the organization is absolutely critical. And without having that visibility, the DevSecOps practice is fundamentally going to fail, right? Because you can't protect what you don't know. That's the absolute basic, right? The idea was essentially, when you build your DevSecOps process, when you build your security practices, don't just hang it on the wall and walk away, right? Spend some time looking at it, thinking about it, sort of deciding what additional stroke needs to be done, what small changes need to be made, right? Make sure lots of people come past it and sort of look at it. More eyes on that problem, right? Whether it's consultants, whether it's insiders, whether it's your dev teams, whether it's your QA teams, have people look at these things so that you sort of get additional inputs, additional value, because security is always going to be an iterative process, right? It's always going to be a sort of a tug of war. I won't say tug of war, I'll say balance between the guys build it and the guys who are trying to secure it, right? Because you have to sort of get both their inputs into it to sort of come back with the absolute best output. So that's the takeaway that I would ideally want from this talk, is that we really need to make sure we don't just build security plans and processes, but really evaluate them, really run them through the gauntlet, and then sort of iterate a few times around and keep iterating at a certain frequency, right? To the point where we believe they're really, really hardened, really tightened down, and that should be hopefully a goal that you've set and you'll be able to achieve. Yeah. So I think we have a couple of minutes left, so anyone has any questions or things of that nature.
Yes, sure, Harsh. Thank you so much. I think you covered a lot of topics and you touched upon it. We have one question. Let me quickly share. The question goes like this. Is there any observation made from all the data collected on the vulnerability testing part of it? And if you have any, can you explain it with an example?
Sure. So typically what happens is when we do these vulnerability assessments, right, we'll try to identify patterns. And I think that's really important, right? Because what happens is anytime you do a security audit, you're going to find a certain subset of security issues, right? You're never going to find everything. So what's important is if you can collect all of that data for your assessments across years, across quarters, across periods, and basically say, these are the patterns that I see across my organization, my dev teams, and then either try to come up with DevSecOps controls that address them, right? So say, for example, you're seeing OWASP issues, a WAF is a great control to integrate that will address them, right? Suppose you're seeing default password policies and things, then maybe some sort of IAM SSO is a great policy to implement. So you have to so when you do a security assessment or a vulnerability assessment, look at it as a yardstick, right? These are the set of problems I see. These are the underlying root causes that I think are relevant to us. Address those root causes and not just the problems, right? Secondly, sort of addressing the root causes, you might find 3 vulnerabilities, but you might fix 15 of them because you address the root cause that's then going to eliminate a whole bunch of other issues. And I think that's something that is that we all really need to focus on. So don't just focus on problem solution.
Thank you so much, Yash. That was a very extensive coverage of many topics. And thank you so much for answering the question so well. We are very glad to have you here with us.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.